Well, good day, everyone. Welcome to a virtual discussion here from up here in Canada. My name is Ryan Brook. I'm an associate professor at the University of Saskatchewan, and I and my students have been studying wild pigs here in Canada for a little over 10 years now, and we're sort of been the only ones in the whole country so far that have really paid much attention to these beasts and done the science on them. And so what I'd hope to do today is provide an update to the 2020 status of wild pigs here in Canada. And I recognize Ruth Aschim, who's my PhD student, who's been working on this for 6 years now, and Corey Kramer, who's doing his master's with me and has been at this for almost 2 years now. So if you want to follow us, check us out on Facebook, Wild Pig Research, and follow me on Twitter at Ryan K. Brook. Happy to provide some insights. And so to sort of start this off, I guess I'll just say that this has been a 10-year effort for me. I started at the University of Saskatchewan in 2010, and this was one of my very first projects to start to see what is going on with wild pigs. And when we started 10 years ago, it's fair to say we knew virtually nothing about the status of wild pigs, and we have come quite a long way in the last 10 years. So let's just get right into it. I certainly want to acknowledge not only my graduate students, but lots and lots of people across Canada, especially folks in the Moose Mountain eradication team who've been hugely influential in not only teaching us a lot about wild pigs, but supporting our work in all kinds of possible ways. And so big shout out to them and to the many, many dozens and dozens of people that have helped in the field and helped in all sorts of ways, and to all of the provinces around Canada and indeed the territories as well have contributed occurrences and insights and support. So thanks to all of those. So let's start at the beginning of the story here. In the 1980s, there was a very big interest in diversifying agriculture. So this idea of having cows and wheat was fine and dandy, but really there was this desire, and it was quite convincing to agricultural producers across Canada that you needed to diversify to succeed in the modern era. And so through the 80s and into the 90s, there was a strong push to get into elk ranching, emu farms, and of course, wild boar farming was a big one. And wild boar farms were established across Canada. Wild boar were brought over from Europe primarily, and they were raised on farm primarily for meat production, but also there was a relatively small number, and still are a small number, of high fence shoot operations as well. And this worked well, and indeed still today we have a small number of well functioning producers that you can go and buy meat from these, and that can be quite good. Unfortunately, there were a lot of very poor operations, and that has caused us to get into the situation that we're in right now. And so here's a map of all the census data to show that it started in the 80s and 90s, and production peaked in 2001. This was seen to be a big opportunity for Canada, that there was going to be this large international market, and we were going to all get rich from selling wild boar. And so we really jumped into it across all of the provinces, and indeed in the Yukon Territory as well. And this started off quite successfully, and there was a large growth in farms. You can see, in some areas, even into far north of Alberta, in central Canada and Saskatchewan, very high production, large numbers of farms spread around. And so there were subsidies, there was training, all sorts of things to get this production off the ground. So this is the first time that anything that looks or acts like a wild pig or wild boar was brought into Canada. There's no evidence of any movement from the US. And of course, at this time, there were little to no wild pigs anywhere near the northern US states as well. So we know for sure that the source of all of our wild pigs here in Canada is from this domestic source. And this is what a conventional farm looked like. This one was actually just outside of my hometown here of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Interesting production values here, but one of the challenges is that these farms, for the most part, seem to operate largely like rogue nations and were left on their own to sort out their own rules. And the fencing, there is, if you look closely, you'll see a single strand of electric fencing, but otherwise a pretty rickety affair of pallets nailed together. And so this was not keeping pigs in. They were going under the fences, they were going through, and of course we get very high snow accumulation here on the Canadian prairies, and they were going over these fences. And so we had lots and lots of escapes. And even by their own estimates, the Saskatchewan government was looking at about 3 to 4% escape rate, a number of decades ago. Um, Unfortunately, a really important part of the challenge has also been that there have been purposeful releases. As this market peaked in 2001, following that, there were large numbers of farms, especially on the Canadian prairies, Western Canadian prairies, that released those animals on purpose. So they just simply said, we're just not making it here. This isn't working, and cut the fence, knocked over the fence, and away they went. And there have been certainly many dozens of farms that did that. And so we had releases, and then we had these purposeful uh, let the entire herd go. And in some cases, it could be over 300 animals at one time that were released into the environment. And a lot of experts at that time said, no problem, these will never become established. No pig is going to survive an extreme cold winter here on the prairies where, we could have, I remember not that many years ago where we had 38 days where it was never warmer than minus 30. And so very, very cold, quite long winters with deep snow, thought would wipe them out. But of course, they're very well adapted to the cold. And that has not been a problem, and they've thrived in the wild. And here we have a trail camera photo that shows an odd mix of pigs. And this one, if you look at the two in the front at this bait site, they look like classic European wild boar. Behind them, you see some very shiny animals, and those are actually domestic pigs. They have no wild boar genetic in them at all, and those are actually some free-ranging uh, feral domestic pigs, not wild boar at all. And then in the back, you see some spotted animals there, and those are surely hybrids of the two. And we sort of officially refer to this as a shit show of wild pigs. And this really speaks, I think, to the sort of challenges that we have, that this isn't just one type of animal, but in fact, we get a whole range of them. And not only wild boar and domestic pigs and their hybrids, we also are increasingly seeing pot-bellied pigs as well. So this broad term wild pig really does apply here in Canada for sure, in the sense that it does capture more than just what often people refer to as wild boar. We have a lot more than that. It really struck me too that I've shown this photo over the last quite a number of years, and nobody has ever asked me in Canada, where are these free-ranging domestic pigs? Because we do have a few of those around the prairies, and to my knowledge, there hasn't been any effort to sort of clean that up. So we do have this picture really does highlight the sort of situation we're here in Canada, where not only do we have a lot of things going on at the same time, but not a whole lot of effort to really deal with it or clean that up. And to my knowledge, with all these escapes and releases, there's been very, very minimal, if any, attempts to get those animals back in a fence or euthanized. So this was largely left to take care of itself. And indeed, what happened is they've expanded dramatically from these initial herds. There's a animal that was just somebody I work with here in Saskatoon. Their parents had this animal came a few weeks ago and was chasing their horses around. And this is not a classic looking wild boar and looks an awful lot like a potbelly pig to me. And so we get a whole mix of animals that we're seeing on the landscape, and increasingly, and especially just in the last 6 months, I've received quite a number of sightings and photos of animals that look a lot more like pot-bellied pigs than conventional European wild boar. And certainly we've seen a very dramatic expansion. These animals have thrived. There was a lot of conjecture, as I say, that they wouldn't survive the cold weather, and also that they wouldn't have the reproductive rates in the north that were seen in the south. And indeed, in fact, we're seeing very high reproduction. Certainly, the big group sizes are becoming much more common. When we first started in this in 2010, a big group was 7. Eventually, in the first 2 or 3 years, we saw a group of 11, and that was a big deal. And now we're starting to see sounder groups of several dozen animals. And certainly we have sightings from regional biologists, in fact, that saw certainly on the order of many, many dozens. So group size has, or at least the largest groups seen on the landscape, have been on the increase. these hybrid animals are quite well established for surviving in these cold, and we get big animals. So 400 plus pounds is not particularly surprising anymore when hunters get them. The largest animal we've handled in our research group over the last 10 years was 638-pound female. So they can be quite large. And of course, this is highly adaptive. We know that large-bodied animals are going to do particularly well in the cold environments. And in terms of reproduction, we've looked at animals that we've actually captured and done necropsies on and shown that the litter size is 6 on average. And this is data from our trail camera work that shows that we also have almost exactly 6 young per litter showing up on trail cameras, but also that we have newborn or very, very young striped piglets showing up in all seasons across the year as well. Seems to be some variance across, as you would expect, but certainly we're seeing piglets in all seasons across the year, showing that it is continuous reproduction. And certainly we're seeing evidence in our trail cameras. We don't have great data on this yet, but definitely the trail camera data are indicating that they're having more than one litter per year, and at least in some cases. We definitely need to look further into this. In terms of occurrences, we've been a storehouse for all of the sightings in Canada, and my PhD student Ruth Aschim started this 6 years ago and interviewed people, and we've collected occurrences from media reports. We've run our own trail cameras. We've received several thousand trail camera images from people out on the landscape, especially landowners and hunters, and we've triangulated these and really done thousands of hours of work to collect and document all of the occurrences with different methods. And what's very clear from this, and again, I don't think we should be surprised by this at all. Of course, anybody that knows wild pigs, they follow this same curve, right? This same epidemic curve, this high reproductive rates, high dispersal, plastic diet, they'll eat anything. And so wild pigs do exactly what wild pigs do here in Canada, and they've increased exponentially. And so, especially just in the last 4 or 5 years, we've really seen a dramatic increase in occurrences. Are these data completely randomized and stratified? No. Has been a bit of catch as we can in terms of sightings. But that said, we do have accumulated many thousands across many different methods. And I'll share the title of the paper where we looked at this in quite some detail and compared all the methods. And what's interesting, of course, and the big take home is that no matter what of all the different methods you use, shows essentially the exact same exponential curve. So we're quite confident that this is well documented, that while the specifics are open to some discussion, and certainly we're continuing to work at our, broadening the methods and being more systematic in what we collect, we could say with very, very high confidence that this strong curve is clearly it is well established in Canada, especially in central Canada in the prairie provinces, but we're seeing spread across other provinces as well. So here's our first map, and this was first product of Ruth's work, and indeed I would say that this is the only national data set that occurs for anything related to wild pigs in Canada. So this is by far the most defensible data set we have, and indeed is by far the best and indeed only real national set of data that we have to represent all of Canada. And there's the title of the paper. I'll post my email at the end of this talk, and so if you want to shoot me an email, I could share the paper, but just search that title and you'll find it as an open access download. And that's where we really break down the details of this. But suffices to say, in 1990 to 2000, there were not a lot of pigs established. So this is a relatively recent phenomenon compared to the US, for example, where it was really only not that many years ago, on the order of just over 20 years ago, where we saw very small numbers established. And we mapped them out here by level 9 watershed. So any of the red splotches or Rorschach images there on the map to represent a level 9 watershed, which is quite comparable to the size. It's conservatively comparable to the size of an average home range of these animals. By 2010, we already started to see some expansion from that, and certainly, again, those three prairie provinces in the center are really where we're seeing the focus, and indeed we'll continue to see the focus of the expansion, some in British Columbia to your far left, but those three central provinces is where this has been, there was a large number of farms, very expansive agricultural production, and so lots of room for them to grow, lots of source populations that were escaped and released on the landscape, and lots of natural wetlands and wild cover for them to hide in. So it really has been an ideal situation for these pigs. And then by 2017, and this is the end of Ruth's data collection for her PhD work, shows that the watersheds have expanded. We have seen quite a number of sightings in across the Canadian prairies. BC on the left has had a few. Ontario, the large province to the right there, you're starting to see right along the US border. Those sightings there have been a number of them, and also a small population in Quebec as well. And so this expansion has been documented about 90,000 square kilometers per year. So very rapid expansion over huge areas. We're talking on the order of 700,000 square kilometers. So really, really large area, bigger than many countries. You know, the range of these. We were in Spain talking about this and explaining that the range of the pigs here in Canada is now comparable to the total size of the country of Spain. So very, very large areas where these pigs have expanded, not at high densities, but certainly occurrences have been well documented through this range. We're working on an update to the 2020 update right now, and we see now all these are just I've just plotted the occurrence data. We'll get those watersheds mapped soon enough, but we're starting to see a number of sightings across Canada, but a tremendous number on those Canadian prairies, and just really, really increased. Now, to be clear, in the last 5 years, we've also done we've done the only collaring studies ever done of Canadian pigs in Manitoba and Saskatchewan in the center, and we've run more trail cameras, and so there has been some more increased effort in some localized areas, but certainly the large majority of these points spread over are from a whole range of data sources, again, all supporting the same notion that we've seen this really, really dramatic expansion. Again, most areas not seeing huge numbers, and these kinds of maps make for very interesting discussion in Canada, because a lot of hunters will say, geez, we've been out and looking hard and we're not finding them. And so these probably represent low densities. These animals have also been hunted extensively right from the beginning when they were escaped or released. And so these are very human averse animals. So they're hiding in the heaviest, nastiest, ugliest cover. And so what's interesting is you ask the average Canadian, even in the core area where we're seeing lots of these, people have just perhaps never seen one in their lives. So these are not walking through cities yet. They're not widespread and abundant. And certainly a lot of people are not seeing them. This is probably one of the biggest challenges, I think, in terms of management, is they're unseen, and so therefore they're not seen as a real problem. There have been a few vehicle accidents, certainly extensive crop damage in many areas across the prairies here. No signs of disease from the very limited testing that's been done yet. And so nothing has really triggered anybody being particularly concerned about them. And again, with not lots of people seeing them outside of hunters and landowners in certain core areas, this has been quite off the radar for people. And many have been pretty shocked by the extent and certainly the density of sightings in some areas. If you look at Saskatchewan specifically here, so I highlight all these points in blue, you can see that the quite a strong majority of sightings are here in Saskatchewan, and that reflects a number of things. Certainly, sport hunting has played a major role in helping to spread these pigs around the landscape, and I think that we wouldn't have anywhere near the distribution if it wasn't for sport hunting that has been very, very active and promoted strongly in the province. There's a lot of really good habitat, especially in that central area where we have lots of potholes and lots of forest cover and wild areas mixed with agriculture. And for the most part, that northern edge you see of those dots represent the edge of agriculture, with that one exception of a a dot quite up towards the letter W there in the boreal forest, but for the most part, they've been relegated to the southern half of the province and come up to and into the forest fringe, so this edge of the boreal forest, but so far, relatively few north into the boreal forest yet, but widespread across the province and increasing, as I say, dramatically, even from 15 years ago when we started. And when Ruth started her PhD with me, one of the concerns I had was she actually started her master's first, and I wasn't sure there was going to be enough occurrences across Canada for a rigorous analysis of the distribution. And that was only 6 years ago. And so we've gone from being concerned that we need a backup because we're not sure there'll be that many occurrences of course, the more you look, and this was the first real hard look and systematic collection of data across Canada. We collected sightings from the provinces, but also our own data from tracking people down and doing interviews. We did a national telephone survey, so lots of intensive data collection, but still showing that clearly these numbers have, the distribution has gone up dramatically. So in terms of risks and impacts, this is not going to be that different of a story from any of the other countries around the world or from the US, is that we do have concerns around disease, and African swine fever has not been found in North America, but it has been expanding quite rapidly the last year and a bit. We've been particularly concerned about the spread of African swine fever and what that might entail. I think the experts are quite accurate in saying that it's more likely to show up in domestic pigs, but when we see photos like this, where we see lots of interaction between our domestic pigs, this is in a backyard operation, and that's again probably where we're most likely to see that disease showing up, is where we see that exposure to wild pigs. In this particular case, this landowner, the wild pig, had shown up, jumped the fence, and became a permanent resident and just stayed. And indeed, that spring, all of the piglets from all of those sows had the classic dark color and the horizontal cream-colored stripes, and were indeed sired by this particular animal. So lots of interaction occurring across, especially again in the prairies where the overwhelming majority of our occurrences are. Very clearly, this is for the most part a Western prairie issue, although again sightings in British Columbia and Ontario and Quebec indicate that they have some homework to do for sure, but overwhelmingly it's a prairie issue, and this is where we have high levels of livestock production. So here's some work from Ruth's PhD, and again these are all watersheds mapped out, where each watershed has that's shown here has at least one sighting of wild pigs, so we know they're there. And overlapped with all the places that we know we have domestic pigs as well. So we have in some cases where we see the darker red, we see more wild pigs and more wild domestic pig farms. And so this doesn't say that there's contact. This just means that they're sharing the same watershed. All these watersheds are relatively small, in the order of 200 and 300 square kilometers. And so this certainly shows the general areas where we're seeing high overlap between domestic pigs and wild pigs. And that, from a disease perspective, is not necessarily alarming, but does set up the context of animals being in relatively close proximity. I will say that from the collar data, we're finding a lot of fine scale of results showing interactions as well. In terms of crop damage, and again, no surprises here. And really the story in Canada is that wild pigs are doing exactly what we know wild pigs will do. They're reproducing rapidly, they're eating lots of different things. We're seeing some important hot spots where they're feeding on agricultural crops. Now, interestingly, in Saskatchewan, there have been relatively few claims for crop damage, but from our collar data, we know quite well that in fact pigs are spending a lot of time in agricultural crops, exactly as we would expect. And nobody from any other country that has them will be surprised by this. They are attracted to the highest quality food sources they can find. Here's a trail camera from last summer of them getting into fairly early stage corn, and they do a tremendous amount of damage. And the folks at Spruce Woods Provincial Park in Manitoba This was the last year they grew corn in that area and just said, forget it. We've got so much wild pig damage. We either have to move it quite a few miles, on the order of 15 to 20 miles south, and grow it somewhere else, or just have different crops, because the pigs were just flattening it. And they get into potato crops and virtually every kind of crop we have collar data showing pigs spending time in it. And so, yeah, again, no surprise here. This is absolutely consistent with their global activities everywhere else. And so they're hitting these high value, high protein, high energy crops with quite significance. Why we're not seeing that translate into as many uh, compensation claims, that is less clear to me, but certainly we know that they're feeding extensively on these. This is a quick shot from Corey's work and shows all the different crop types. But on the top graph showing selection, we have nighttime selection for corn is by far the highest. And again, this doesn't surprise anybody, and really is consistent that corn is king when it comes to pigs, and they will track down and will take actually quite amazing risks to get to corn, the highest quality food that they can find on the landscape. And it's not shown here, but we also know that males are probably 4 to 5 times as high likely to take that risk and chase after corn as females with young. But selection for a number of crops, especially during the nighttime, they're avoiding some of the low crops. And this is the other thing of corn, of course, is not only is the food value, but when it gets past knee high, it starts to provide that hiding cover. And then through mid and late summer, it's got excellent hiding capacity as well as food value. But certainly during the nighttime, animals are feeding on a number of crops here, and oilseed crops as well. We have very, very expansive canola production as well as flax. And so they're feeding on that. And forest cover is important. They do need hiding cover. It is open season on them essentially across the prairies, and people do hunt them and certainly shoot them. My summer students last summer went to their very first site the very first day, and as they were traveling to it, they went through or past a cornfield, and there were dead pigs lying in there. Somebody had shot them that night and left them lying in the field. And so they do get shot at. And so there's some pretty clear differences here between daytime and nighttime selection, with them tending to avoid a lot of the egg crops during the day simply because they're going to get shot at. On the Canadian prairies, we also have some new technologies and relatively new approaches, I should say, that, for example, these large grain bags, basically a gigantic Glad garbage bag that you can put several 100,000 or million calories worth of grain product. And so this one, animals have walked across the top of the bag and ripped it open, and you can see it's spilled on the ground. This is huge volume of grain, and becomes an accessible food source for pigs. And so in Canada, we have this huge pulse of summer. And so right now we're getting close to the longest day of the year. And so we have these really long days, typically with lots of sunshine and plant growth. And so our agriculture is quite productive through the summer. And we see this huge burst of growth that we're just getting into, towards the peak now. And then these long, cold winters with snow. But agriculture the practices have typically left out hay bales out on the landscape, grain in bags. We have switched. A lot of agriculture has gone to what we call swath or bale grazing, where you cut your crop and or bale it, and then just leave those out in the field, fence them off, and slowly remove wire by wire, and let your livestock access the crops. And that works great from an agricultural perspective, but leaves lots of food out on the landscape for these pigs. So they are accessible. And then this certainly speaks to the survival through that, when we have that week, which we always have, where it's 40 below, and just seems that you don't understand how anything can survive outside. And this is one of the reasons that they thrive. Pigs can actually bury themselves into these piles of grain, and it's been seen a number of times. They just simply literally live in their food pile, and they can consume enough calories that survival is going to not be a problem. And so ag plays a tremendous role in the growth and expansion of these populations. Certainly there's not a lot of evidence for a lot of our native species that winter can be very, very limiting, especially as we get into February, March, and we've been in months of heavy winter. If these animals are accessing lots of egg crops, it just isn't doesn't becoming a limiting factor, and they can be out and moving and active at 30 or 40 below and do just fine. This video came out just this past year, and this is one still shot of it, but you can see clearly on the left what is quite a good sized wild pig. And in the video, this is a school bus driver just stopped on the side of the road, and in the video you hear the children chatting away and giving advice on what to do with this pig. But in the video, this pig follows this group around with these calves out in front, and it puts the run on him for some time. We haven't seen really any cases of predation on any livestock that I've heard of in Canada, but we have heard lots and lots of stories of harassment of livestock, especially cattle, where we have lots of extensive cattle on summer and winter range on the prairies, and where these pigs are coming in and disturbing the animals and scaring them off feed, scaring them off water, and putting stress on them. And so we don't expect that predation will probably be a huge issue, but we do know from well over a decade into 2 decades of reports coming in of harassment and disturbance by these pigs. And so this is one of many issues. We worry about disease, we worry about crop damage, and we certainly worry about the impacts on our livestock production as well, from not so much from predation, although we do have quite a number of sheep and goat producers we've been talking to about a risk there. Species at risk are a significant concern, and so we have piping plovers along the shorelines. We have some of the best piping plover habitat in Canada. Actually, the large majority of it is in Saskatchewan, and these pigs are now wandering along these same shorelines, and we're quite concerned about impacts on them, as well as ground nesting birds, and indeed how far north are these going to encroach into woodland caribou habitat, and what kind of impacts might they have on these already in peril species at risk woodland caribou and their range, because we know they're such destructive animals in wetlands and other habitats. So we have a number of studies going on right now looking at expansion in caribou range and overlap and potential risk with other species at risk. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that we don't know, and probably more things that we don't know. As I said, we've sort of made this strong case, or that the spatial expansion data and the range distribution data are by far our best and arguably only really good defensible data set that we have. There are a bunch of things we don't know, and the question we get more than anything else is how many are there? And the answer is we have no real idea. We're moving towards that now, and so we have quite a lot of trail cameras, and we're setting up some networks of trail cameras across the Canadian prairies and hoping to grow that to try and get some answers to what is the population density, where or what's the population size, where are some of the hot spots of density. We have certainly a good sense of that from all of the data we've collected, but in terms of total population size, we really don't have a good sense of that at all. How far are they going to move is a very open question. We do know that white-tailed deer are now sighted quite frequently north of the Arctic Circle, and so whitetails are surviving very far north, and north of 60 for sure. And so if white-tailed deer can survive that far north, that certainly raises questions about the expansion of wild pigs into the far north as well. And they've already been sighted in Alberta, at the 58th parallel, so getting close, not that far from 60 degrees north. And given their adaptability, and also that we do have agricultural production increasingly in the far north as well. Agriculture is spreading north, and that's going to only help those pigs move. We don't really have any good data on disease. There's been very limited testing in very limited areas of disease from a small number of animals, and so in terms of disease, we know very, very little about that, and there's been a real strong reluctance to do testing for the concern of, what happens if you do find disease in these animals. But I think given our concerns about African swine fever and certainly potential for other diseases, I think that's a major gap in our knowledge. What's happening along the Canada-US border, this obviously has huge implications for the US. And we've heard lots and lots of concern, very, very justifiable and wise concern coming especially from Montana, about, are these animals going to move south from the border? And if you look at, have another look at that distribution map, and there are confirmed sightings along that Canada-US border at a number of points across the provinces. And so this is a really significant a concern, I think, and something that hasn't been looked at all in Canada, or at least in terms of, what do we do about it? How do we, I will say though that there has been a transboundary group that's been formed, and there's been more discussion about this in terms of at least sharing knowledge. So if there's a sighting right on the Canada border, right near Montana, that at least they're going to get a heads up immediately so they can respond. In terms of other countries, we do know they've established in urban areas. We've been seeing them around major cities for quite a number of years now, well over 10 years. No sightings yet that I'm aware of in urban areas, so going through major cities or anything, but to my view, that's only a matter of time. I think that's something we're expecting, and so we're in holding now with COVID, but certainly the plan is we have trail cameras to set up a significant network here in the city of Saskatoon, as that's probably one of the more likely cities that's going to first see that occur. And so we're starting to monitor through the river valleys and across a whole bunch of urban environments to see probably not if wild pigs establish, but when they start to show up in these cities. I think that's a fair expectation. And we certainly know from, you look at some of these videos that have come out of Berlin, where you have these well-established urban populations. I think we're going to start to see some of that occur as well. And people here on the prairies are not surprised, or not so surprised, when they have foxes under their garden shed, and increasingly coyotes denning under their back fence or on their back property in rural areas, or urban areas, I should say. And I think that it's just a matter of time before we start to see these pigs starting to move into cities as well, because of course, with limited or no shooting opportunities, that it's going to be and lots of things to eat. I think it's going to be perfect habitat for them. So those are some of the things that we're particularly interested in from our research perspective, and hope to start to address as we move forward over the next decade. So in terms of really summarizing the status of, okay, where are we at in Canada? One thing that is quite clear from our occurrence data and our analysis of habitat is that we have some really strong, well-established strongholds on the Canadian prairies where they're just permanently established. And it's not just numbers of animals, which are quite high, and number of occurrences, but it's just the habitat. We have these really massive areas where we can go many miles without roads, very extensive areas of wetland, forest cover, incredibly wild country that is very difficult to access. And it's fair to say at this point, for many, many years, I always said that, the window is open for eradication in Canada, and that we have the potential, if we get on this and very aggressively and immediately start to remove whole sounders of pigs, and really try and have, a plan and a broad approach and an aggressive effort, that we could eradicate pigs. I've said that for quite a number of years. I don't say that anymore. I just don't think that that's realistic. Now, that said, these are fairly localized areas right now, and so that does mean that we do have a lot of opportunities over most of Canada to eradicate and maintain pig free if we get on it. But again, we're not seeing that broad effort, and so I don't see that changing anytime soon. Sport hunting is widespread. Success rates are very low. I get lots and lots of phone calls from hunters saying, "Where can I go? I'm gung ho." And then they call me back and yell at me because they can't find any, because they are often nocturnal. They're in very high hiding cover. And so we see this usually quite a significant spike in October, when we see the most hunters out on the landscape looking for white-tailed deer. They do see them from tree stands and from pushing bush and driving around. And so we do see people harvesting them, but certainly from our collar data, we only had a handful of animals that were shot. Over 5 years of tracking GPS collared animals, we only lost, I think, 4 animals to hunters, something like that. And so, and many hunters said, "Oh yeah, you tell us where they are, Ryan, and we'll clear that area out." And I said, "Actually, in your back 40, in the area you're living right now, we have 7 GPS collared animals." And they said, "Oh no, that's not true." And I showed them the data. And in fact, I've said to people, well, I'll tell you where they are. If you can take them out, go for it, because they are hard to find. They're highly mobile. These animals have, home ranges that are over 300 square kilometers, so big home ranges and big movements. So, and so overall, sport hunting has not been successful in the sense of them getting animals, but we do believe that it has had a major impact on spreading them around the landscape, breaking up sounder groups, dispersing animals. It does definitely put the run on them and move them around the landscape. And so this has been a major factor. And certainly I've said many times, and I do believe that you can have sport hunting or you can have eradication. You can't have both. You have to pick one. And so far, the Canadian Western Prairies have chosen to allow sport hunting, and not only allow it, but it's been actively promoted, and there have been regulation changes to make it more accessible. And so I think that decision has been made, that sport hunting is certainly valued more than any notion of trying to eradicate. And it's also well established, of course, that sport hunting, there are lots and lots of good hunters out there doing, good practices, but we also know that the Yahoo hunters get completely in the way of any kind of professional or coordinated government-related control efforts, and they move animals around and they scare them. And we've experienced this our own in our research. We flew with a fixed wing spotting pigs because we had a helicopter coming for capture. And the next day we went in with the helicopter, and people had spotted our plane and gone in on the ground and shot up the animals and scared them away. And the 14 sites we had identified as our core captured areas had 0 pigs because of that. And so that's just one example of that people, maybe with the best of intentions, certainly can get in the way of other activities. And so there is no case to be made for sport hunting being part of certainly by itself, being part of an eradication effort. So national eradication is no longer feasible. Canada has pigs. They're here to stay. I don't think there's any case can be made for total eradication. That's not to say that it's completely impossible, but certainly given efforts so far and given the establishment and that entrenchment in these areas, I think from a rational perspective that I think we have to think about a different approach than this idea that it's feasible to remove them from Canada at this point. Most areas of Canada, it is feasible. Here's images of us capturing pigs with net guns. And so there are tools in the toolbox. There are lots of opportunities. This is a huge area. I mean, wild pigs now occupy an area of about 1 million square kilometers, a little over that actually. And so this is tremendously widespread. And so if there is ever to be an effort to eradicate, then I think that that's still possible at this time. But again, the more we wait and the more we don't take really strong action against these pigs, they just continue to spread and grow very, very high reproductive rates. They can move and disperse very effectively. And so those areas where we can eradicate or just continue to disappear, and there'll be more and more firmly established. Many people have asked me, is eradication feasible in some areas? The actual answer that I give is that we have no idea because we haven't tried. There has not been a really full-throated effort to eradicate wild pigs anywhere in Canada yet. And so we don't really know what's possible, but certainly based on, I think, our understanding of distributions and pigs and efforts from other places, I still do believe that over most of Canada, we have the opportunity to there are a few areas that are pig-free, that we can stay pig-free, and areas where we have populations at low densities that could be removed. So certainly a possibility, but again, there just hasn't, since we've started in 10 years, not a lot has changed. So I don't see any real feasibility yet, or that I think we're just going to still see that ongoing expansion. So I will say with very, very high confidence, and this is my opinion based on the data we haven't done any modeling of this, but I don't know that we need to. I think we can safely say that eradication probability under the current status quo in Canada is 0. Populations are expanding out of control in many areas. There are a few hotspots of effort. Alberta has been quite aggressive in their approach, and they have just completed a pilot study looking at ways to find and remove them. Saskatchewan has been trapping and removing pigs for quite a number of years now. And so those are two provinces that I would say have a control program in place that has been effective at finding and removing pigs. So there is some good efforts there. And obviously, from my perspective, anybody that is out finding and removing whole sounder groups has my 100% approval. And this is exactly what we need to do. And so I 100% support those folks that are, doing all the tremendously hard work and indeed dangerous work of finding and removing pigs. But currently these are small spots, and so we have well over 100 watersheds now, certainly into 200 plus watersheds with wild pigs, and only less than 10% of that where we see control efforts. So it's pretty limited right now, and certainly not even close to being where we need to be to even level off the population, never mind talk about reduction or eradication. So there is no discussion that I'm aware of really or meaningful or truthful discussion anywhere in Canada about eradication at this point. We don't have a national strategy. There has been a national group that's been formed, actually two groups, one that's an operational group talking about strategies and approaches, and one that's more of a governance, sort of a higher level look at things in Canada. And so there have been some positive steps. And this is, I think, good thing to have this discussion, but we're still, I would say, fairly quite a long way off to have any kind of a national strategy. Here in Canada, the large, overwhelming responsibility when it comes to these kinds of issues like wildlife are really at the provincial level. This is quite different from the US, where the federal government plays a significant role. Here, the federal government could and should play a role in sort of coordinating and helping to pull this together. And we're seeing some of that now just in the last year, which is a good bright light that is a good thing. But in terms of having a plan and having any kind of resources to support the provinces, there's just nothing there yet. And I don't know that any of that is coming anytime soon. I will say Alberta is the only province of the 10 in Canada that has a provincial plan in place. And certainly, I think it would be fair to say if you're looking for indicators of success or thinking of where are we going to be 10 years from now, if you don't have a plan in place, I think that we certainly can't have any kind of an adult conversation about eradication. And so it would be fair to say that most provinces have not taken this seriously and continue to largely ignore it. And so we're not seeing a lot of progress in that regard. With, again, some important bright lights and some removal going on. But as we well know with wild pigs and their capacity to grow and spread, is that you don't dabble in eradication. You either go full in and have a plan, a detailed science-based plan, and a strong effort, and go in aggressively and really massively focus your efforts. And that there is no example of that yet in Canada. The main focus has been meetings, and there have been lots and lots and lots of meetings, and I've been to certainly well over 100 meetings over my 10 years on this file, and increasingly so. Lots of discussion, and there has been some higher level meetings and some increased focus. Certainly the first 7 years of this, rarely did anybody return my emails or phone calls, and there was not a lot of discussion or interest in this at national and provincial levels, or local levels for that matter. We're seeing a lot more. I'm getting invited to a lot more different types of meetings where they want to see what the science is going on with pigs. And so there's interest, there's discussion, but it is absolutely true. And I've talked about getting t-shirts made, and I need to do that this year. But the t-shirts should read that meetings do not eradicate wild pigs. And so while we've seen a growth in discussion and certainly more people talking, endlessly having rounds and rounds of meetings is not going to eradicate pigs. So while we've seen this growth and discussion, we're essentially in largely the same place that we've been 5, 6, 7 years ago. And so not a lot of focus outside of a few limited efforts in 2 provinces to really get serious about removing them. And some are stepping up now, and Ontario has seen growth in sightings and good effort. And I really applaud Ontario and their efforts to recognize that they have a small problem, and this is a very good window for, they're probably the best example of a province that has a small but important number of sightings and has a real possibility with a relatively small effort to find and remove these pigs and become pig free and stay pig free. So they're a very good example where they're embracing science and taking a very proactive approach. And so we do have some good bright lights. But the problem, of course, is that when you've got different provinces all doing their own thing, and every province has their own strategy and their own, and in many cases, there is no strategy. In Manitoba, there's no plan, there's no control effort of any kind, and it's just been ignored completely. And so, with every province doing their own thing, obviously, no individual province is going to have long-term success. Alberta is doing lots of good work, but the complete and massive expansion of wild pigs in Saskatchewan puts them at huge risk, regardless of what they do. So, good fences make good neighbors, and certainly there is a need for more collaboration and more consistency in approach. Every province has their own take on all aspects of this, and so hopefully some of the meetings that are occurring now will lead to more collaboration, data sharing, and certainly controlled efforts to really find a national coordinated approach to this rather than sort of a piecemeal area by area. Ground trapping has been occurring, and so certainly there is one person with one trap in Manitoba, I should say, that's killed some pigs, and that's a good thing. But pretty minimal effort in Manitoba, and this is a landowner, not a government run effort by any means. And so there has been pretty limited success there because one person running one trap is not going to have a big impact. There has been extensive ground trapping in Saskatchewan with very, very good success, and that's been a bonus, and they've really ramped that up in Alberta as well. And so lots of good effort here in that, and certainly we know that ground trapping is a really good tool in the toolbox. I will say that I think that we need to have a much bigger toolbox. We have found from our own research that Judas pigs can be very effective, and helicopter capture is extremely effective at finding and removing pigs. And so there are lots of other tools in the toolbox that could and should be opened up here, that we're not going to eradicate wild pigs using a single approach. I think that's quite clear. Disease testing is a big open question. Again, the domestic livestock industry has been fairly strongly opposed to the idea of testing wild pigs for fear of what might be found. And so the federal government has not really had any interest yet in doing any kind of disease testing. I actually have freezers full of samples, so if there is interest at some point, we can certainly contribute those to the effort. But right now, we really don't understand disease in pigs, and we do have some diseases of concern, not only African swine fever, but we had not that many years ago an outbreak of bovine TB on the Canadian prairies, and we had a fairly well-established population of wildlife with bovine TB in Manitoba. And so there are certainly some diseases that we should be looking much harder at and be aware of. And obviously, I'm not a fan of just going out and testing, and I've said that many times, that just going out and collecting animals and sampling them is not a good approach, because you do need to have a strategy both on the wildlife and the livestock side. Say, well, if we do find something, what do we do about it? So obviously, disease testing can have major implications. We know that in Canada in 2003, we were sitting in a meeting talking about bovine TB, and all of a sudden everybody's phones went off, and we had our first case of BSE, and one case of BSE mad cow in cattle, and our borders were slammed shut, and it just was a massive impact. And so obviously, this is a very sensitive and cautious issue we need to be careful with, but ignoring it is also highly, highly problematic in my view. And then last but not least, we do have a program here in Canada called Pig Trace, and it was established initially for domestic pig farms. So the premises ID'd, and animals going in commercial production either had a tattoo or an ear tag or required by this program. And so this has been quite good in terms of gathering data, some of which we've used on the domestic pig side, and small backyard farms versus conventional shower in, shower out big commercial barns, and where they are and numbers. Been very, very successful program, but it is technically also legally supposed to include domestic wild boar farms. And we still don't have any good data on where these wild boar farms are, how many there are, and numbers. And so these continue to be, I think, an important source. We still have leakage from these farms, obviously, of widespread and growing free-ranging pig population. But they say, well, where's the low-hanging fruit? Well, these domestic farms, getting them properly fenced, monitored, and certainly preventing escape and release, but also having a program where they're marked, because we have sampled lots and lots of animals from our capture program, and we've collected ears from hunters for our genetic analysis, working with the folks at the USDA. And of all those ears, we've never seen an ear tag, we've never seen any holes in those ears, we've never seen any tattoos of any kind. And so we've never seen a marked animal in the wild that, and indeed, one of the animals we captured in our first year in 2015 was actually a castrated male. And so that animal had obviously been born on farm and escaped, but had no indication of where it came from. And so I think that could be a real opportunity to, and again, it's probably one of the lowest of the low-hanging fruits, is to look at the domestic wild boar farms, both the high fence shoot operations, which we know are leaky and continue to put animals out onto the landscape, and the domestic farms, which are also leaking pigs as well. That, again, becomes less of an issue in the broader context of huge reproduction in the wild, but there's some simple things that could be done here in Canada that wouldn't cost a lot and would be highly effective, and certainly show that there's some effort there. So that's a quick overview of where we're at in Canada. I would say that despite there are some good bright lights out there. They're small and they're spread out. So there's some good news stories. And as I say, I mean, anybody that is, any group or especially government agencies that's going out and finding and removing whole sounders of wild pigs, I'm 100% supportive of it. But right now, we are firmly entrenched in a way too little, way too late approach. And unless something changes very dramatically, very quickly, we're going to be overrun in a lot of areas. And those areas of firmly established populations are going to be larger and larger. And even 1 and 2 years from now, we can say with confidence, given this massive growth rate, that this is going nowhere but worse under the status quo. So if anybody has any questions or comments or wants to chat about this, shoot me an email. My email's here. I particularly want to note the USDA, who has funded the large majority of this. And we've had lots of questions of people saying, why is the USDA funding research in Canada? Well, I think we've made the case today that one of the reasons is that what's going on in Canada is putting the US in direct harm's way. The assumption has, or the concern has been really primarily before this research of pigs moving north from the higher densities in the south. And that is something to be aware of and concerned about, but certainly this really growing out of control population in Canada is a significant concern for the US. It also highlights, importantly, that these wild pigs, many people have said in the early days to me, well, of course, we know that wild pigs are southern and they live in warm environments, so we're not going to see them in the North Dakota, the South Dakota, the Montanas of the world, simply too cold. Well, we're certainly here to say today that they can survive a 40 below period in Saskatchewan under deep snow, and pigs do very, very well. And indeed, ironically, in the warm areas of Canada along the coast, we see little to no wild pigs, really virtually nothing to speak of in these warmer environments. And it's really the very coldest parts of Canada, in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and parts of Alberta, where we have, certainly at least in the provinces, the coldest periods and lots of snow, where we're seeing firmly established pig populations. So there is, I think, direct relevance to what's going on in the US, and we are, as a continent, there aren't a lot of borders, and certainly are limitations to pigs moving across those borders. So tremendous thanks to the USDA. Virtually all of this research would not have happened without the USDA. Locally, Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation, my University of Saskatchewan, my first startup grant that I got in 2010 when I first got this job at the university, was buying trail cameras for pigs, and they've supported me through that. The Fish and Wildlife Development Fund in Saskatchewan and Sask Pork have all contributed to this. And so there's been some key partners to keep this fairly small program when I was visiting in the US, there'd be meetings regularly of all of the people working on wild pigs, and you could fill a room and there was a bunch of people calling in. In Canada, when the entire research team across the country gets together, my 2 grad students come and sit in the 2 chairs in my office, and the 3 of us have coffee and talk about wild pigs. So we're a small bunch, and so we're fairly limited in terms of what we've been able to do. But we've come a tremendously long way in the last 10 years in understanding this problem. And while right now the story looks pretty grim, it does hopefully increasingly point to the need for some real rethinking here in Canada on taking this seriously and really getting aggressive sooner than later. So that's it for me. Thanks so much for attending virtually. It would have nice to have seen you all in Florida, perhaps have a pint after, but such is the way of COVID. And hopefully look forward to seeing you again soon, but certainly reach out and tell me how you're doing. And I'm happy to share information, especially those US states that are sort of raising their eyebrows watching this going, what does that mean for us right along the Canadian border? We're happy to talk data, and we're looking at that in quite some detail, actually. So happy to talk about any collaborations, and many thanks to a whole bunch of folks who've helped to contribute to this along the way. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye.